Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our weekly reading of Nietzsche's The Gay Science. We begin this week with Chapter 1, Aphorism 13. On the Doctrine of the Feeling of Power. Benefiting and hurting others are ways of exercising one's power upon others. That is all one desires in such cases. One hurts those whom one wants to feel one's power. For pain is a much more efficient means to that end than pleasure. Pain always raises the question about its origin, while pleasure is inclined to stop with itself without looking back. We benefit and show benevolence to those who are already dependent on us in some way, which means that they are used to thinking of us as causes. We want to increase their power because in that way we increase ours. Or we want to show them how advantageous it is to be in our power. That way, they will become more satisfied with their condition and more hostile to and willing to fight against the enemies of our power. Whether benefiting or hurting others involves sacrifices for us does not affect the ultimate value of our actions. Even if we offer our lives as martyrs do for their church, this is a sacrifice that is offered for our desire for power or for the purpose of preserving our feeling of power. Those who feel, quote, I possess truth, unquote, how many possessions would they not abandon in order to save this feeling? What would they not throw overboard to stay on top, which means above the others who lack the truth? Certainly the state in which we hurt others is rarely as agreeable in an unadulterated way as that in which we benefit others. It is a sign that we are still lacking power, or it shows a sense of frustration in the face of this poverty. It is accompanied by new dangers and uncertainties for what power we do possess, and clouds our horizon with the prospect of revenge, scorn, punishment, and failure. It is only for the most irritable and covetous devotees of the feeling of power that it is perhaps more pleasurable to imprint the seal of power on a recalcitrant brow. Those for whom the sight of those who are already subjected, the objects of benevolence, is a burden and boredom. What is decisive in how one is accustomed to spite one's life? It is a matter of taste whether one prefers the slow or the sudden, the assured or the dangerous and audacious increase of power. One seeks this or that spice, depending on one's temperament. An easy prey is something contemptible for proud natures. They feel good only at the sight of unbroken men who might become their enemies, and at the sight of all possessions that are hard to come by. Against one who is suffering, they are often hard because he is not worthy of their aspirations and pride. But they are doubly obliging towards their peers, whom it would be honorable to fight if the occasion should ever arise. Spurred by the good feeling of this perspective, the members of the knightly caste become accustomed to treating each other with exquisite courtesy. Pity is the most agreeable feeling among those who have little pride and no prospects for of great conquests. For them, easy prey, and that is what all who suffer are, is enchanting. Pity is praised as the virtue of prostitutes. As this little note claims, this is Nietzsche first developing some of his ideas around the will to power, which would come to greater importance and development in Zarathustra. If no one wants to jump in, I can start working through this.
There's one other earlier footnote.
Fascinating last line. I would read this in not as actual prostitutes, but as people who, if you know, in the Bible, you have the like the whore of Babylon, and like when the Bible speaks about things like that, it's not actually talking about prostitution in that sense. It's talking about people who, like, say you turn away, and this is one of his great themes, where people turn away from what is actually true just to kind of feel less bad or to keep their truth. It's like when you, like a lot of people, you sort of prostitute yourself to, like, say, a political party, even though you don't. I don't know if that's a good example. You get what I mean. It's not actually. It's talking about that turning away from the actual truth.
Like a mercenary to the highest bidder for your feeling of power. Right? At least in the context
well,
of here.
you could look at Republicans, like people who have prostituted themselves towards Trump is a fine example of it. Like
right, but
someone who is absolutely like
over
they remain in power and they remain on the true side, or the side of, they remain on the side of power, but they know that it's really untrue in their hearts. They've prostituted themselves to that, and that's the sense that it is.
It's a counter jibe at the very people who carry pity in their hearts and ascribe it in an essentialist way onto other groups, in the sense that and the German is rühmt, which is like it's more like boasting rather than necessarily praising. Praising is only the like moral twist and lie you give yourself in order to feel. It's literally in the lines above that Mitleid ist das angenehmste Gefühl bei solchen. So Mitleid, pity. So it's this essentialist mode of ascribing pity as the only virtue which this other group of people sort of deserve from us. They themselves have an essentialist cause in them that requires us to show them pity because they are so kind of degenerate or beneath us or fallen or whatever.
Right. The huddled masses.
Yeah. So it's this double jab. It's like those who are too pitiful have no dignity in themselves and belief in themselves, and they, in their charging of prostitutes as deserving only their pity, in fact prostitute themselves in society as dispensers of pity who are life denying.
Okay.
it's this very first explication of the idea of the will to power. I think it's written here too by Kaufman. Yeah.
The other thing that jumps out to you in this is the chivalry part. If you kind of think of the project, which is going back to those medieval sort of the singers and the entertainers, like this joyful, jolly sort of thing. It's you get vibes of how how can you have an aristocracy without having an aristocracy? It's trying to insert a kind of aristocracy back into society.
Yeah, I think I know what you're getting at with that idea.
And you see that in a lot of other authors who've obviously read Nietzsche.
I'm not sure I really understand the point you're getting at. Could you or
if I could maybe have a crack at it, Jay Kiwi, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, let me know. Which is, I see politics writers who critique liberalism and socialism, to a lesser extent than they obviously would criticize things like authoritarian structures or fascism, which they would. I'm thinking of your Chantal Mouffe and your Bonnie Honigs here, who've used Nietzsche. This quote, along with, is comes up a lot when referencing like anything from Will to Power or much later works. This was a fantastic quote to come back to in the gay science because this is really early development of social political interrelations of sort of what we owe to each other as sort of ideas and a thought, and how power is distributed in that kind of matrix. And that's, I was going to say, it's left my brain now. The agonistic tradition. So agonism, and as opposed to antagonism, finds some of its roots in passages like this from Nietzsche. I can chuck a link into the chat if anyone is following afterwards. Wikipedia's page on it is not bad. If you look up agonism, agonism.
Yeah, I mean, I think we even talked about a little bit in some of the poetry on Nietzsche's sort of insistence on the need for struggle and competition, things like that. This line kind of jumped out at me, especially because of some of my reading of Twilight and his talk of causes there. We benefit and show benevolence to those who are already dependent on us in some way. And then in parentheses, which means that they are used to thinking of us as causes. I think that one's really interesting and can be, immediately applicable to like modern political social theory, right? That this, I'm immediately sort of reminded of things like charity is not the right word, but philanthropy, right? There's sort of this this causality that's established where the philanthropist is sort of treated as a cause of their own philanthropy, right? Of their own magnanimousness, of their own sort of giving away to others their pittances for their acquired power and wealth.
Yeah, +1. Thinking of us as causes, I think, is, yeah, +1 to highlighting that bit too.
What I was sort of getting at is you have these moneyed classes who believe that they're right and they're true, but Nietzsche wants to insert another class above them. Or kind of break through. That's what I mean by trying to assert an aristocracy again.
Okay.
That's my thoughts on it.
Yeah. I put in the chat basically something akin to mixing a bit of Machiavellian agonism, and I'd probably throw in that the sort of the positive ways in which Nietzsche reflects on the sort of civic aspects of the Roman Empire, where he describes people as being citizens, full-fledged citizens, as being free, not insofar as there are institutions that engender any semblance of quote-unquote rights, which would be a horribly anachronistic way of thinking of rights-based contract theory back onto the Roman Empire, which Nietzsche is, when he speaks of it, is trying to highlight something positive in the civic aspect of these full-fledged sort of citizens in their freeness. As I said, it has nothing to do with some institutions that give them that freedom. It's the fact that there are institutions that are in part unfree, and it allows its sovereign sort of citizens to test themselves against that institution in a social network or capacity. So people are free. This is a criticism both at having shitloads of government versus having no government. Oh, if we just had no government, we would all be free. Like this kind of an ANCAP or anarcho kind of, to a certain degree, you could charge a lot of anarchism with this critique as well. But all political theories, which is that if you have shitloads of institutions or none, there's no like perfect balance per se. The balance is the fact that individuals can prove their freedom against those institutions without their demise being sort of, bet out. Am I making sense in any kind of way?
I think so. I think I'd have to go down a big sidetrack talking about the implications of that and whether I agree, but I don't know if I really want to go down that sidetrack right this moment. I think it's an interesting point, though.
See, very, very quickly, my reading is that you've had the old aristocracy and the nobility replaced simply by the moneyed classes and the bourgeoisie, and they simply believe that they're right just because they're people with the money at the time. But this is how can we reinsert a kind of intellectual aristocracy. This is not a nostalgia or a trying to bring the previous. I don't mean aristocracy in the previous sense, but it's like, how can you insert a kind of intellectual class above the moneyed classes again?
Okay, so by aristocracy here, I guess what I'm hearing is that you mean more of like the aristocratic values of
And that's
sort of
why he
will and
leans on the
competition.
idea of the chivalry there.
Yeah, will and competition without necessarily bringing down your opponent. It's sort of you're both benefited in some way from a struggle.
Yeah, and Jake Kiwi, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I would characterize perhaps that relation between two members of this sort of higher group playing out may not be comprehensible to someone who is not of that group. Like the way that two higher kind of members who are more equal to each other in their sort of exuberance of life affirmation and their pride in themselves, etc., when they come in competition with each other or show each other exquisite courtesy, that might not be comprehensible at all to an observer who's not in that in-group. It could even show its opposite, like it seems strange or wrong or... Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me, because we recently went over it in a class I'm in, is the story of Achilles. Rumple? No, outside my house, right outside the window of the room I'm in. There's a weed whacker. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully the filter catches it, but that's okay. But yeah, the story of Achilles, where I'm forgetting all their names now. The father of Hector comes to Achilles, draped in rags, and begs for his son's body back. Right? He's the king of the city being sieged, and he basically comes unarmed in rags to beg for his son's body. And Achilles, instead of killing him, ends up granting him the request. And it's sort of supposed to be this like magnanimous mutual recognition of like bravery and stuff like that. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, to a certain degree. I think that there are a lot of actions that friends and foes alike of a certain stature who, in the very act of having a social interaction, which could include everything from mercy to aid to murder, in that display to other observers, the act, what happens in front of their eyes could be completely irrational, make no sense whatsoever, have no utilitarian value, have no function value to any function that observer has in their repertoire to pull from with which to post hoc understand the situation. That complicates political life immensely.
I think it's a little bit confusing to me as well, because I feel like I remember at other points Nietzsche talking about sort of going all out in struggle and competition, sort of like by any means necessary, right? And so I guess if I understood that correctly at the time, I feel like that's somewhat in contradiction with this idea.
Could you reference the by any means necessary? What are you thinking of
Not
there?
offhand. I'll have to look for it after the reading. It may be something that I interpreted as such, but wasn't what he was speaking of. But it might be from Twilight or from the poems. I'm trying to remember.
Mm. Plus one to the contradictory kind of notions, though. Contextually, in different bits of Nietzsche, you'll find bits that contradict each other. There's parts where sort of this go forth, be involved, be life affirming, but then at the same time, wars of the current age should be but a distant murmur to you. You know, the goings on at the local politics should be whatever, like, you can do better. Um, there's other bits that are sort of like, oh, be Epicurean, just live outside the city walls, you know, within your means to not attract horrible attention and have a lovely garden and have friends over. But then there's these other times where it's like, no, leave that garden and go and join into the city and fight in sort of, you know, antagonistically and or agonistically within a political kind of realm for a particular purpose that you have decided is worthy of your investment, and then you can just duck back out again. Feel like you can find a bit of that.
That's what I mean by the aristocracy. That
Right,
going
okay.
outside.
Okay. Yeah. I think I can see that a little better now. That's making more sense. And I think the adaptability is part of the thing that Nietzsche gets at, right? Is the adaptability and the ability to sort of find clarity uh, with uh, with different passions and forces and stimuli and everything to find a life affirming state within one's or within a certain arrangement.
Yeah, I guess this is to just wind back to the mention that I brought up of institutions. If we think of institutions then in this context, with all that in mind, where do they fit in? How do we relate to them? This was this idea of like, the freer a person is a sign of how well they can push back against institutions and how responsive those institutions are to accommodating for political um, conflict and means. Not to get away from political conflict or to elide it, but to support and sustain it in a way that the polis that doesn't destroy the polis, its members. Yeah, I'm implying an agonistic relationship between not only citizens, quote unquote, between each other or members of a society and each other politically, with this passage in mind, in how it complicates the political or politics writ large, but also between individuals and institutions.
I'm reading this part again. An easy prey is something contemptible for proud natures. Blah 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 blah. Against one who is suffering, they're often hard because he is not worthy of their aspirations and pride. I think, but they are doubly obliging towards their peers, whom it would be honorable to fight if the occasion should ever arise. I think so. I think this is again sort of getting at this like new nobility idea, but I think there's kind of an interesting thing that could be dug in on here, which is the deciding of what is a worthy foe, right, or a worthy uh, relationship of struggle, right? Like partially how pity works is by sort of designating those who are designating people as those who are below you, right, who are deserving of pity, right?
Yeah, I'd agree. I found a 2-sentence Lem quote kind of related to what we've been discussing. And I think a crucial warning about the sort of will to power conceptually, that it's not about having power over others. That's part of the crude setup at the start of this passage about how power and pity are related and intertwined. The Lem quote is short. It's on page 42 from Nietzsche's Animal Philosophy, Culture, Politics, and the Animality of the Human Being from Vanessa Lem. It is, quote, "What is crucial in this distinction is not an affirmation of power over others, but on the contrary, an affirmation of difference as a precondition for conflict and struggle. Nietzsche believes a fruitful antagonism is threatened in a society of equal rights, where equality names the universal identity of all rather than the universal respect being owed to each and every individual on the basis of their differences."
Yeah.
Contrast that to what pity does.
Right. Pity places, a direct relationship of the one giving the pity, the as he said, the benevolent that makes the other dependent.
Correct.
Does that seem deeply Schopenhauerian to you, the kind of metaphysic?
Maybe to a degree.
Because it's a bit like the Christian metaphysic of equal kind of dignity for each individual. But Nietzsche's sort of turned it over. So
I'm not super familiar with Schopenhauer, so if you could expand a little bit on what you mean by like a Schopenhauerian metaphysics in this, how it relates to this, that would be very helpful.
I can only say that Nietzsche was deeply influenced by Schopenhauer. I'm not a huge reader of him, but just it seems like a kind of framework from Schopenhauer that he's appropriated, but he's kind of reversed it or turned it over.
Yeah.
Are you saying that because like Schopenhauer sort of considers life inherently kind of like pitiful, or am I getting that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Pitied so much so that it should be annihilated.
Right.
To the
And so
extent
it's sort
that
of
it embrace nihilism and nothingness.
And so it's sort of like being in a pitiable state is like the natural state of man, whereas those who seem to be rising above it are like sort of deluding themselves, right? Whereas this is sort of putting it the other way around, where those who are refusing to pity are actually sort of those who are uh, living with life, right? Does that make sense? Or
Yeah. I think JK was on to something in that there's a lot. When it seems like Nietzsche is just taking a bit of Schopenhauer in Schopenhauer's metaphysics to kind of run against the Enlightenment project or against Kant, is the bit that sort of the like where it diverts from. You're ever kind of wondering, oh, where is the diversion point? it seems very similar in writing. It's in one part a jest at the moralizers of his era who are going to be reading him, proto-Prussian historians who are coming up with myths about the new nation and why it's always been this way, British psychologists who he's rambling against, and your Hegelians and your sort of politicians of all stripes and colors. But at the same time, that departure point is always going to be a bit where he's going to be affirming life and running either counter to a Christian moral tradition or using that tradition itself to critique Schopenhauer. It's kind of ironic. Because there's a slice there that's also showing that Schopenhauer remains, despite himself being the first true declared atheist of Europe, not actually. Like, he still walks in the shadows of dead gods. He may have considered himself a god slayer, but he doesn't acknowledge it.
The last thing I'd say is that he's also, this is kind of a reaction against the Romantic movement. And if you imagine part of what some people consider the psychic development of the Romantic movement was, part of it is the idea of people going outside to be alone to prove their inner resources. And
yeah, there's more of a positive existentialism in there, in its critique of the romanticized return to Munker kind of like ideal. Sorry, I'm being kind of like extreme there in pigeonholing that. But yeah,
that people, he's saying there's both, like that's what I mean by, and I'd say, I'd give the example of the American author Hawthorne, who in America in the same period said, this going outside to be alone is putting on the aristocratic thing, and it is what will destroy our democracy. And so you've got Nietzsche here saying, like, there's times to be put yourself above, and there's times to be in the city fighting in the streets.
Yeah. I think, without trying to hammer the institution point home too hard, this is in itself has to be a critique, though, of any government or bureaucracy that principally groups people in a pitiful or pitying way, and how it designates the sort of differences between members of a that it rules over. Pity itself can become a mode of different levels of pity, of how bad or awful off some group are, that must be looked after for their own good.
Right, yeah.
The homeless, the prostitutes, the whatever, the war widows.
And you don't, this is different than empowering them to necessarily like empowering opportunities to overcome those conditions. It's sort of like the pity of those conditions and giving sort of these being in this relationship of pitying, of like giving them your scraps. Right.
Yeah. The ascription in the power relation assigns that as an essentialism that one can't escape or crawl out of.
I'm going to go ahead and get started on number 14. The things people call love. Avarice and love. What different feelings these two terms evoke. Nevertheless, it could be the same instinct that has two names. Once depreciated by those who have, in whom
Deprecated, I
the
think.
instinct... Oh, deprecated? Yeah, you're right. Once deprecated by those who have, in whom the instinct has calmed down to some extent, and who are afraid for their possessions. And the other time seen from the point of view of those who are not satisfied, but still thirsty, and who therefore glorify the instinct as good. Our love of our neighbor, it is not a lust for new possessions, and likewise our love of knowledge, of truth, and altogether any lust for what is new. Gradually we become tired of the old, of what we safely possess. And we stretch out our hands again. Even the most beautiful scenery is no longer assured of our love after we have lived in it for 3 months. And some more distant coast attracts our avarice. Possessions are generally diminished by possession.
What a line.
Our pleasure in ourselves tries to maintain itself. I'm curious. How do people feel about stopping on each paragraph or going the whole way? Because I feel like we often end up talking around the paragraph sort of out of order when we do
I think
the
it's
whole
good to
thing.
read the whole paragraph first.
Okay, yeah, I'll continue on then. Our pleasure in ourselves tries to maintain itself by again and again changing something new into ourselves. That is what possession means. To become tired of some possessions means tiring of ourselves. One can also suffer of an excess. The lust to throw away or to distribute can also assume the honorary name of love. When we see somebody suffer, we like to exploit the opportunity to take possession of him. Those who become his benefactors and pity him, for example, do this and call the lust for a new possession that he awakens in them love. And the pleasure they feel is comparable to that aroused by the prospect of a new conquest. Sexual love betrays itself most clearly as a lust for possession. The lover desires unconditional and sole possession of the person for whom he longs. He desires equally unconditional power over the soul and over the body of the beloved. He alone wants to be loved and desires to live and rule in the other's soul as supreme and supremely desirable. If one considers that this means nothing less than excluding the whole world from a precious good, from happiness and enjoyment, if one considers that the lover aims at the impoverishment and deprivation of all competitors, I would like to become the dragon guarding his golden hoard, as the most inconsiderate and selfish of all conquerors and exploiters. If one considers, finally, that to the lover himself the whole rest of the world appears indifferent, pale, and worthless, and he is prepared to make any sacrifice to disturb any order, to subordinate all other interests, then one comes to feel genuine amazement that this wild avarice and injustice of sexual love has been glorified and deified so much in all ages. Indeed, that this love has furnished the concept of love as the opposite of egoism, Well, it actually may be the most ingenious expression of egoism. At this point, linguistic usage has evidently been formed by those who did not possess, but desired. Probably, there have always been too many of these. Those to whom much possession and satiety were granted in this area have occasionally made some casual remarks about the raging demon, as that most gracious and beloved of all Athenians, Sophocles, did. But Eros has always laughed at such blasphemers. They were invariably his greatest favorites. Here and there on earth we may encounter a kind of continuation of love in which this possessive craving of two people for each other gives way to a new desire and lust for possession, a shared higher thirst for an ideal above them. But who knows such love? Who has experienced it? Its right name is friendship. Yeah, and Marcellus points out Nietzsche is not a fan of egoism. Especially the kind of I'm trying to think of the right word. Yeah, egoism as in this sort of like self-obsessed, self-centered egoism, right? As opposed to a more direct
Egoism,
expression.
egoism that leads to nihilism, the sterner definition, right? Egoism that leads to nihilism, right? And when we explain nihilism, like we don't explain the non-being, right? The things have, but nihilism in the sense of Turner kind of the fact that the Hegelian dialectics, right, or the Hegelian dialectics, the Hegelian logic, right, leads to nihilism, right? That's the biggest discovery of Turner, right? It is that he discovered, because he's a young Hegelian and he's a radical in his own right. He discovered that, like, you know, the last form of Hegelian logic is nihilism. So that's what Nietzsche. I refuse to say Nietzsche is a nihilist because and one of the forms of nihilism is egoism also, right? Which Nietzsche trying to
LJ
tackle.
says, one of my professors said, anti-neurosis is a good way to put it. I like that. Yeah, it's sort of this going away from this sort of obsessive and neurotic sort of self-obsession towards a more life-affirming sort of self-force, or is that something like that?
If like the whole discourse is about, or the Nietzschean discourse, right? It's about the forces and like how this kind of like yield reactive or active forces, right?
Right.
And the things that we call people call love, right? These things kind of lead to reactive and active force, right? Reactive in a sense that it leads to resentment, it leads to bad consciousness, right? For example, like love of knowledge, right? Love of truth, right? any lust of what is new, right? Gradually become tired and old, right? It become this kind of a reactive force. It become something that utilize resentment, right? Sometimes, for example, the discovery about the truths of religion and how I debunk religion, and ha ha ha, look at me, I am debunking religion, right? I'm debunking Islam or Christianity or Judaism, ha ha ha. Sometimes this kind of grew up into feeble, right? There's an entire movement that build on debunking religions, right? And look what these movements end up, right? Like for example, one of the best example, one of my kind of like better examples is from the United States, and it's internet phenomena in general. It's the Reddit New Age atheists, right? Look to them, right? Look to them. They grew old, you know. They grow feeble, and they stretch out their hands, and they kind of grew old, right? So it can utilize both forces, right? Both ways. This kind of love or avarice or pity, love of knowledge, love of debunking religion, for example, or love of neighbor, right? And it can turn out to be a bad consciousness, right? And it could be an active force. It depends.
Yeah, so here I think if we're applying active and reactive forces uh, here, at least in the more Nietzschean conception of the active and the reactive, I think here this once it becomes part of ourselves, right? I think this is a really key line for this. Our pleasure in ourselves tries to maintain itself by again and again changing something new into ourselves. So it's sort of this active process, right, of overcoming, of overcoming, things in the world, forces in the world, and turning them into the forces that we sort of can see and recognize, that we come to see and recognize as ourselves, right, through exertions of power and force. And so, and he's saying this is what possession means. But once something is possession, is in possession, once it becomes sort of part of one's ability to exert oneself in the world and their capacities, there's a tendency for it to become a reactive force, where then it's about this sort of neurotic, obsessive protection of the property, of the self, of the ego, right? Of these things that all become tied to the ego or are the ego, depending on how you want to talk about it, right?
Right. Right.
And
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Nietzsche, we have to understand that Nietzsche, as the word of Deleuze, right? And other people, Nietzsche practicing a critique of Hegelianism, right? A critique of like young Hegelians, specifically Stirner and like the Hegelians in general, right? He utilized this critique, right? Whether the critique of Stirner, right, or critique of Hegel, right? This is the critique of Hegel. It's not kind of like you cannot remove, like, you cannot kind of like describe Nietzsche as Nietzsche without the critique of Hegel, right? Without the critique of Hegelian kind of idea, the Hegelian idea of the dialectic, right? And Deleuze was very very explicit about it, right? To the point that he repeated that in Nietzsche, Deleuze on Nietzsche and philosophy, right? He very very kind of like hammer this point home, right?
Hello， 听得到吗？
LJ didn't realize they're unmuted.
+1 to the discussion. I agree.
I kind of thought this was more of a critique of Kant.
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious to know, Marcellus, if you could dig a little bit more into how this is a critique of Hegel, because I'm not super familiar.
The critique of dialectic, of Hegel dialectic, it's about the negative. It's about the negativity, the aspect of negativity. Nietzsche doesn't kind of like, he says that, even in Zarathustra, and this is connected to Zarathustra, right? The ass in Zarathustra is kind of like this no, that is say no based on the affirmative no, not the no that is the negative no, right? So it's kind of like, it's connected to Zarathustra, and it's connected to kind of like, it's also connected to the gay science, but to mostly to Zarathustra, and to and I think that as we will finish the gay science, I think we should focus on Zarathustra, the spoke Zarathustra, because that's where you find the argument there more explicitly, right? You can find the anti-Hegelian kind of like sentiments, right? You can find the kind of like the
Here, I guess,
yeah.
I read this as sort of a critique of romanticism, right? And I could see some Kant being in here as well, but I guess I'm having trouble drawing the direct line to Hegel. Obviously, Nietzsche is generally quite critical of Hegel and builds off of Hegel and both of those. But I guess I'm still not really seeing how this is a response to Hegel.
If I were to have a crack at it.
Yeah, go ahead, Rumpel. Marcellus, one sec. We'll get right back.
I don't know my Hegel very well, but I think that there is a way that these authors treat like the continuum of life, of human life and animal life, and reconcile sort of the political environment that they find themselves in. Nietzsche comes along and questions whether or not true, free, subversive spirits can exist in a society to act rationally or otherwise in order to affect it in a way that these authors have suggested that we kind of have agency. Because we don't, right? Like there was sort of
I think if they're doing it rationally, they're already not free spirits, right?
Right, yeah. So like Nietzsche is looking further into the past for inspiration on... Sorry, I have a cat that's scratching. Nietzsche looks further into the past for like civic, socio-political inspiration.
Right.
And in this section that comes right after sort of the first formulation of the will to power comes a section about things that people call love, sexual avarice, and ends on true love being friendship. I think that ties well together with this idea of this will to power and the sort of the agonism that we were talking, or that I was introducing into that there.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that look to the past, how does Hegel, I guess, come in? How does Kant and Hegel come together? Well, like Nietzsche will reject both. And Nietzsche goes back to Goethe and to a degree back to Schopenhauer, because both were more honest as to the socio-political nature of the human animal. Insofar as we're honest about the human animal's inability to be tamed or bred in a particular way. Because if you do that, civilizational project that breeds or chooses to breed an animal in a particular type of way is going to become fascistic.
Not that he would have talked about it in those terms, but sort of this breeding morality project, right?
Or it's life denying because it forecloses all these other opportunities that are coming up. And it also completely would, generally speaking, there's this charge that the civilization project must reject forgetfulness in the animal.
Mm-hmm.
So these observations, effectively the TLDR is that Nietzsche is far more keen to look further back in history to certain characters for inspiration to enhance and enliven the socio-political life of the human animal, and wants to remind us about sort of the mimetic, technical kind of captured space we find ourselves in the problems of language, but also kind of the metaphysical errors that we will begin to hear about. The 2, 3, 4 great errors. And I think it's lovely that we start with power and love and friendship in a critical kind of way really early here. I don't know. Maybe did I consolidate
Marcellus,
there? I don't know if that made sense, Marcellus.
I mean, it all made sense, but I'm still having a little trouble connecting it to Hegel, but that's okay. Go ahead, Marcellus.
According to Nietzsche's affirmation, right? Let's pass it out, right? According to Nietzsche's affirmation, right? And as like I would call it, right? There's includes two negations, right? In the negation of dialectic itself, right? The idea that how can I parse it out? The idea that this kind of like there's no something called bad or unhappy consciousness, right? What Hegel called the unhappy consciousness, right? In Nietzsche, there's the self-destruction, right? This kind of like there's no affirmation which is immediately followed by negation, no less a tremendous or unbounded than itself. Zarathustra rise and in its supreme degrees of negation, destruction is the active destruction of all known values, right? In the trail of the creator, right? There's self-destruction here, but it's not a negative self-destruction. It's an affirmative.
It's the affirmative power of forgetting. Okay, yeah, it's making way more sense to me now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd add to that we can't. Nietzsche would reject that you could selectively destroy one value at a time, kind of thing, and then kind of do the dialectical kind of process that way. There needs to be like a complete reversal, reevaluation altogether anew.
Yeah, the reversal of the relation of forces, an affirmation that constitute becoming active as a universal becoming force, right? So reactive forces are denied in this process, right? By this reversal rumble.
Yeah. And in and of itself, this reflection is positive because the ability for like the human animal to resist the enslaving aspects of socio-political life thus far, to the extent that he's critiquing it, like the very problems he's set up so far about how possession and lust and avarice come into play. Despite all of that, the fact that like we've resisted that to a certain degree so far, otherwise we wouldn't be here, kind of signifies like a future possibility of the animal's return, in my mind, of a more honest politics that doesn't elide forgetfulness and chastise it, and it tries to incorporate it in a more positive way.
Yeah, the power of active force and becoming I think it goes directly back into what we were sort of talking about with egoism, right? The egoism is the maintenance of what is. It's the maintenance of this, construct of the self, of these, of this idea of being, this sort of static representational image, right? As opposed to the active forces, which are always in flux, always becoming. Yeah, it makes. I mean, I'm throwing in a bit of Deleuze there, but I think it's also very Nietzsche.
We had a question last session about Nietzsche's politics, and if I'm going to be a bit biased here, my reading of where you can start to insert a conception of the political here is precisely at this point where you go, well, then what is my interrelation to others? And one could argue that it is one of, broadly, in a philosophical way, responsibility. My relation to others is one of responsibility insofar as how I constitute myself in relation to them, and vice versa, and in the material conditions in which we find ourselves. Because that becoming and overcoming is contingent on a socio-political, like it can't not happen outside that context. That's how language
I'm not
operates.
sure I agree with either of those points. This seems like a whole rabbit hole in and of itself, though.
I just wanted to mention that I thought it was a critique of Kant's metaphysics of morals, where Kant describes the married state as an agreement between two people for the reciprocal use of each other's sexual organs, which is quite a
Lamau.
how can we say this? Quite a dull
contract lawyer brain.
Let's say a disenchanted view of marriage.
Yeah.
But so I thought it was more a critique
like a
of
rationalist.
That, which is that the two people are actually alienating each other for their purposes, for their desire. But then the last thing is very nice because you'll find in a relationship when if you look at your grandparents or people who've been married for a very long time, that after all the passion and the sex dies away, what's left and what keeps people together is the friendship. And I'd say that's a very accurate reading of relationships.
Yeah. This sort of mutual growth, right? This mutual. There's not really the same level of like possession, but it's a, as he's saying, it's sort of this shared push towards the future, towards becoming the active force.
Futurity or futurist, the futureness I think is big here. It's because it connects back to posthumous ones. And I would say that you can take this concept of sexual relations between a monogamous unit. You could use it just as much to hop back wider into wider politics, because the wider political is still in part constituted by those who have and those who have not, by means or by capital, or in other regards. Because Nietzsche would deny any concept that we've all come together in a kind of like socially agreed way to do government, right? No, government is those who have, and they correspond their action to those who are constituting the right to have and maintain that. And any claim to challenge that notion, it is going to have to be mediated by whether you fall in the in group or the out group.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I just wanted to mention briefly, if anyone sort of missed it, is that this is absolutely also a critique of like, especially like the moralism behind monogamy, right? But even just the idea of this sort of like that one partner belongs to another in that way, right? Rather than this idea of mutual bonds toward a shared higher value, right? And that
Yeah, no,
it can mean monogamy, but it's definitely sort of critical of some of the more some of the ways monogamy is talked about and especially enforced.
one thing I thought was interesting, kind of taking the marriage and the kind of comparisons to Hegel. One thing I remember Zizek always says that like here's someone who's really like lovesick and just like can't stop thinking about a person. Like the best way for them to overcome that is to get married, and that's where that love kind of comes to die, and that kind of just like falsifies. And so like I
Well, yeah, that's a
definitely
classic like Zizek Lacanian thing, from my understanding, is like you're sort of in love uh, with the thing you can't have, right? And it relates to this idea, but it's definitely sort of got its own ins and outs.
a quick question for maybe Rumpel or whoever else wants to answer it, because in the last section it talked about like a feeling of like responsibility to like a kind of like a fake sense of responsibility that people feel towards one another when they just kind of like each other and they just kind of build off that. And it sounded like he was more kind of condemning that aspect of things, where here you had a different version of responsibility, Rumple, that instead unites people. And I guess interested in kind of what you meant by that.
I see that as the life affirming reading. So when I say politics as responsibility, I don't mean in, oh, like an Aristotelian sense, what we owe each other to maintain the illusion of whatever rational choice framework we pretend we're under, that elides power relations and the initial violence of the whole setup and state of affairs. I mean it in a broad political sense or philosophical sense. The characterization that is being set up here is one of relationality. And there is a lot of talk of owing things to oneself, to each other, being understandable and held to account. There's a relationship to truth here, broadly, right? Like in the sense of like, am I calling fire in a crowded theater to identifying things that are healthy versus not, blah blah blah.
There's talk of possession. I just sorry. I mean, you can keep going, but I guess I'm not sure that I am. I don't think I'm approaching the way that Nietzsche is talking about these things the same way as at least you're extrapolating there. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt so badly. Keep going.
You're good. I'm cross reading both backwards and forwards from this section. So I guess the summary effectively is there is a relationality being set up. There is a critique of some of the ways that we currently understand essentialisms that we bestow onto those relational kind of situation we find ourselves in. And if we're going to continue, which it looks like we are, right? Return to monkey is not on the table, not doable. Just bailing out 100% ain't doable either. And kind of pretending that we can do changes within the way that it's been understood hitherto is probably not entirely viable either, or we'd be kidding ourselves. What are we left with? A responsibility to each other to coexist, fundamentally.
I'm not sure I agree, at least within Nietzsche. Like responsibility is fundamentally like a moral claim about what one owes. I don't think that fits at all. right? I mean,
how else do you do the social project?
I'm not sure.
And then, like, I'm thinking here in a sort of as extra moral as possible as you can render responsibility.
I don't know what that even means.
in kind of like it's an honesty of the situation we find ourselves in. When Derrida talks about this in his kind of idea of hostility and hospitality. He kind of combines the two into hospitality. There is like a finiteness to which we can give ourselves to others, make ourselves available to others, their whims, their requirements, their injuries, whatever, their hunger, their sexual desires, etc. That there is a finiteness there fundamentally, and there is a point at which, no matter how well natured or intentional about this whole thing that you might be, where you just kind of snap and it's too much, right? And you tell them to get the fuck out of your house or something. But there's the kind of I'm doing it horrible injustice because there's also this kind of tension of that there's like a duality here, and that the possibility of one, or the fact that one exists, implies the negation and therefore still the possibility of like the opposite, which could be hostility.
So I guess the way that I would talk about that would maybe, at least in terms of Nietzsche, would be kind of how Marcellus was sort of getting at, of the active and the reactive, where it's sort of this idea of becoming active, right? Of exerting force. But to me, that seems like the opposite of responsibility, where responsibility is about what one should do, what one ought to do in relation to others. That seems like that's more of like
if forgetfulness
reactive, right?
is active, then can't we have how does forgetfulness tie into hostility, hospitality, and responsibility in a socio-political way? If we have left behind a bit too much of our animal forgetfulness, does the will to forgetfulness deserve to be reincorporated into the political to some extent? And if so,
yes,
to what degree, and how would that look like?
Wouldn't that mean forgetting responsibility as well, though? That's the part that I'm hung up on.
Yeah, to a degree. Yeah. It could mean making a promise and reneging on it and forgetting about it. And that then has implications should you find out about that after the fact, if someone pulls you up or tells you, and the conditions under which that happens. It could be a friend who's like pissed with you, or it could be a best friend of yours who years after the fact says, by the way, remember how you promised me this? And you're like, oh, fuck. Like, I totally... I kind of mean in a... Walzian, I think maybe you were about to say something when I kind of trying to kind of cast responsibility in a kind of extra moral sense. Like, I'm not trying to start with moral philosophy as first principle here. Put it that way.
It sounded like that to me, the way you were first outlining it, as like, things that we owe each other and to society. And that I'm not so hot on. I guess maybe I'm still struggling with what role the word responsibility has in this. Even debt, I think, to Nietzsche, I mean, like, if there's debt, the worst thing that can sort of happen is that debt being a permanent sort of crippling of the ability to be active, right?
Bring it back to agonism. There is a responsibility to your opponent in agonism.
Oh, okay.
There's a passage, I thought it was in Gay Science, we'll find it later, where it literally talks about it's good to have debts to in a society, and like that arbitrariness of a debt that can later be paid off and kind of overcome. But it comes not from like a lack, but it comes the debt or even the responsibility comes from interacting with the world and those around us, rather than like an eternal like Christian debt where I'm always in debt to Christ.
Right.
Where on the other hand, it's like, no, I'm interacting with the world, and as I do that, I gain kind of more power, and there is very kind of arbitrary stuff that I run up against. But as I get past that, and as I have the ability, most importantly for Nietzsche, to get past those where there's obstacles, but manageable obstacles, then there is a debt that's more playful and comes from more of an excess of self. At least that's what I kind of am seeing from what I've seen from Nietzsche, and trying to
Okay.
piece what I'm from what Rumpel's saying a little.
Yeah, you've spurred me here to kind of maybe a bit that I really should have said at the start is I'm not talking about freedom or responsibility in the sense of that of the individual, because that's anachronistic, and that's not what Nietzsche talks about either. Nietzsche's conception of the individual's freedom or responsibility is never individualistic. It's always considered from the perspective of the whole species. All of us.
So would like responsiveness maybe be an okay term? I don't know if that's quite the right thing, but
Yeah, that's probably a better
I think
vibe than what I'm trying to get at than what I've been using. Because yeah, responsibility has this kind of strong ethico-moral philosophy / legal kind of connotation that I do not want to apply necessarily at all.
fair enough. Yeah.
Like, it has to be a responsibility and freedom that, on the one hand, overcomes the kind of politics that devalues the individual, whilst at the same time, like, trying to cultivate freedom as being kind of responsiveness that overcomes the kinds of like politics that devalues that individual freedom, and the responsibility cast as network interrelations that we have that sustain our socio-ethical life. Chains of dependencies, if you want to put it that way. Materially,
Okay.
Psychically, like in the way that we psychologically, the way that we nurture and look after each other, to our very material condition, down to like sewage systems or whatever.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think I'm understanding that, at least where you're coming from better. That makes sense.